Department of Commerce and Economic Development. I think I lived in an apartment on Davis or Rodney, I'm getting mixed up now. An old brownstone apartment with no air conditioning, hotter than Hades on the second floor, and a bathroom down the hall. But when you're 20 years old and you're a guy, you can make do with just about anything. So Helena is a special place, and the Historical Society. I've had readings other places, but this is a special joy. Thank you for being here.
We're very pleased that you're here, and it'd probably help if I turn this on. Would you like me to introduce you?
Sure.
Okay.
It seems immodest to do that myself.
Good? Okay. Author Dennis Gobb was born and grew up in Montana, as you just heard. He left to receive a bachelor's degree in journalism from Northwestern University and began a newspaper reporting career that took him to Colorado, Wyoming, and Michigan. He returned home and worked 20 years as a sports writer and city hall reporter for the Treasure State's largest newspaper, the Billings Gazette. Although he spent years in the newspaper industry as a reporter and editor, he changed careers and worked in the software industry more than a decade before retiring from the corporate world in 2017. As a high school senior, working part-time for the Gazette, he helped cover the dramatic climax of Win 'Em All. After publishing that book in 2016, he resumed work on his second book, Midway Bravery, which was published in June. Dennis then relocated to Billings. His son, Julian, lives in the southwestern Montana and is employed in healthcare. So please welcome Dennis Gobb.
Try to set it. If this goes black like this is going to turn off in a few minutes.
Oh.
So I wonder if we can keep this.
If I can, should I change the, let's see if I can figure out how to change, let's see, so I'll go into my settings and somewhere display and tell it not to display. There we go. Auto lock, we'll say never.
Okay, will your battery be okay?
Yeah, it's got a good charge, yeah. Thank you, Deb. One small caveat, my son, Julian, has relocated to Billings, and I want to also make one thing personally clear because it's important to the story. I became a widower, well, almost exactly 3 years ago. Carolyn, who is part of this story, my wife of almost 20 years, sadly died of incurable brain cancer, and I've since remarried. This lovely lady back there in the blue shirt sitting next to Chuck Johnson, Kathy, is my wife, and we have, among other, we have a son and daughter-in-law now who live in Billings, both working in healthcare, and thanks to Kathy, I now have 18 grandchildren, 6 more adult children. Suddenly the family grew exponentially. Okay. Now, I think we've got an hour, so I'll try to be respectful of your time. If I may, let me briefly tell you about the genesis of Midway Bravery and really of my book authoring career, which was kind of convoluted. And it's mentioned in the introduction to the book, if you have had a chance to glance at it. Very briefly, I left the newspaper business and went into first bank operations with Wells Fargo in Billings, and then I was recruited to Right Now Technologies when it still existed, and worked through the transition when the governor's company was sold to Oracle, continued working there, and my late wife Carolyn never knew me when I was a newspaper reporter, but she knew that I nurtured this cockamamie dream. Am I right, Chuck? You talk to enough newspaper reporters and they say, I'm going to write a book someday. And I kept saying, I'm going to write a book someday. Well, there was a fateful morning in February 2013. I was working out of my home office in Belgrade. We had moved from Billings to Belgrade to be closer to the mothership, so to speak, a few years before that. I had National Public Radio on. I was streaming it. And I heard, who was the host? I can't remember now, start talking about a World War II hero who had just died, a fellow by the name of Jim Muri. And down in Miles City, some people pronounce it Muri, but Muri is the pronunciation we'll use. It's a Norwegian name. And it talked about his incredible, legendary flight in a B-26 twin-engine bomber, equipped with torpedoes that day. In the early hours of the Battle of Midway, June 4th, 1942, when he buzzed the deck of the Japanese carrier Akaji. He probably launched his torpedoes, as did the other. There were 4 planes in the formation. 2 of them, the Japanese fire got them, and they and all their crew members were lost at sea. 2 planes came back. It's still unclear how many torpedoes were launched. None of those torpedoes hit the Akaji. None. There were also 6 Navy torpedo planes that were supposed to be on the Enterprise, but they got to Midway a little late, so they took off from land. They were a fleet of 10, an uncoordinated attack. The Japanese thought it was coordinated. We were not very coordinated at the start of World War II in the Pacific. Long story short, that was a fateful moment. It helped determine the outcome of the Battle of Midway. Some people call the battle, if you've seen the recent Midway movie, the 5 minutes that won the battle, when the dive bombers, Dick Best and Wade McCluskey leading them, swooped in out of the clouds, sank enough of the Japanese carriers, and forced one to be scuttled over a course of 2 days that Admiral Yamamoto said, enough, turned tail and went back to Japan. And although the Pacific War dragged on for 3 more years, its casualties, including one of my father's cousins, first cousin once removed, who was a Marine who died at Saipan at the fierce fighting there. The Japanese were always on the defensive from then on. It was perhaps one of the handful of most significant naval battles in world history. Well, when I heard the name Jim Muri, I came out of my home office, and my late wife was close to retirement as a teacher, and I said, Carolyn, they just had a story about a guy named Jim Muri. I went to high school in Miles City with a girl, now a woman named Kathy Muri. I wonder if they're related. And this perceptive person, again, who never knew me really as a professional writer, I did business writing, but not as a creative writer, said, without a pause, there's your book. That's how it began. I won't belabor the point. It took some years, but I want to say again, thank you to Kathy Muri, who is married to a high school classmate of ours. I'm not sure whether she's in Miles City or Billings at this moment, but she sent me down the trail finding family members and research and so on. And I will say, I've written a lot of newspaper articles. I've done a lot of writing, a lot of reporting, but I've got a couple more books. One book after that came out this spring, fiction, another book where Helena will be an important part of it, hint, hint, with a guy who flew across the Atlantic and who also made a stop here in 1927 in about 95 years, next anniversary next week. But this book has a special place in my heart. It's probably the best job of reporting I've ever done. And it also, where it resonates with me as a writer, is Jim was a hero of World War II. My father was also a member of the Greatest Generation. He died 10 years ago. He was too young by the time he was drafted to be in actual combat, but he was a World War II veteran by virtue of serving in the occupation, the very important role of serving in the occupation forces in Germany. And I grew up in Terry, started growing up on a sugar beet farm, almost within sight of the Yellowstone River with the Terry Badlands up in the distance. Also lived in Glendive, also lived in Miles City, live in Billings. I'm a Yellowstone Valley boy. This guy was a Yellowstone Valley boy too. When we drove over here, if you're ever on the interstate between Reed Point and, well, between Big Timber and Reed Point, if you're going east, look for the sign that says Bridger Creek Road. Just imagine going off to the south. That's where Jim and his wife Alice, a Riverside, California girl, after he retired, they bought, I think about a 10-acre spread there. Kind of a gentleman farmer, raised a pig, a couple, maybe a steer, some chickens. His wife loved to garden. She basked in the beauty of the crazy mountains and the Absarokas and the Beartooths, and they lived there until 2000, I think. They moved to Billings because his wife sadly had congenital heart problems. She needed medical care, and she passed away about 2001, I believe, on her 80th birthday. And Jim was a widower for the remaining 12 years of his life. And sadly, I never met him. He was living right almost within a couple miles of me, and I had no idea who he was and what he had done until I heard that and started digging through clips. Well, enough of that. What I think I'll do is read the introduction, and then I'll be glad to take some pictures. But before I do that, to set the stage a little bit, see if we can get this. I wanted to show you quickly. I thought, yeah, okay. This, Jim started life, now it's a little grainy up here. If you know where, well, nobody knows, I didn't know where Carterville, Montana is. It wasn't much when he was growing up, and it is nothing now. But right along the Yellowstone River, right on the edge of the big open, Jim and his family, let's see if I've got my perspective right, north of here. Well, I've actually got another picture. Oops. Saw some osprey when we were there. This is what's left of the old family homestead, farmstead, whatever you want to call it, in Carterville, Montana, close to Rosebud, close to Forsyth. That's where Jim started life. And then decided to go to Miles City, to Custer County High School, where I started my high school education, because they had an FFA program, and Forsyth didn't back in those days. Oops. Excuse me, I thought I had a handkerchief. Does anybody have a tissue? My nose has suddenly started to run, and I don't want to. Thank you. This book came out in 2019. I did have a chance to read it to Carolyn in the final stages of her life, and I had started working with the Historical Society in early 2020 to have an appearance here. And then you may know what happened. COVID came along, and lots of plans were flummoxed. Here is the introduction. Mystery Mission. A bugle sounded as a Marine raised the American flag. The stars and stripes fluttered in the gentle breeze rolling in from the Pacific. Reveille roused Jim Muri at 3 a.m. on a day in early June 1942 that shaped his life. He sat up, stretched, rubbed the sleep out of his eyes, and brushed sand off his Army Air Force uniform. Then the lanky young pilot stood up to his full 6'4" stature, bending under the wing of his B-26 bomber, which had sheltered him while he slept a few hours. His eyes adjusted to the pitch dark. Muri, accustomed to quiet nights at his parents' ranch on Montana's Great Plains, awoke to the chattering of albatrosses. It was prime mating season for goonie birds, as servicemen called the white ocean-going birds. Day and night, thousands of them grunted, moaned, screamed, whistled, and scraped their bills in a mating dance. As it had for millennia, the ritual took place on scrub grass near the sandy beach of Eastern Island, a 336-acre dot of land in the Central Pacific. Other members of Muri's crew heard the wake-up call and now stood nearby stretching and rubbing their eyes. They too had slept as best they could outdoors, sheltered by their plane on a balmy night. The group included co-pilot P.L. Prenmore and 5 other men ready for duty in the early months of World War II. 6 days earlier, on May 29th, they had flown the twin-engine medium bomber 1,100 miles from Hickam Field in Hawaii's Oahu Island to an atoll at the far north end of the Hawaiian chain. Their ultimate destination, Midway, comprised 4 islands clustered around a coral reef. Eastern Island, the second largest, was where the Navy had constructed 3 runways to serve Army, Marine, and Navy planes in 1941. Barracks and a mess hall, also built then, completed the atoll's conversion into a naval air station. Why are we here? Muri wondered. The other young flyers, ranging in age from 21-year-old tail gunner Earl Ashley to 23-year-old Muri and 24-year-old P.L. Moore, to the old men of the group, William Moore and John Gojo, 26 and 33, pondered the same question. They and all Americans knew that the U.S. was at war with the Axis powers, Japan, Germany, and Italy. America's efforts to stay neutral ended on December 7, 1941, with Japan's devastating surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, which prompted the U.S. to declare war on Japan. Germany and Italy seized that declaration as justification to declare war on the U.S., which joined Great Britain and the Soviet Union as the Allied powers battling Germany and Italy, the Axis combatants in Europe and North Africa. The English and U.S. now led the war effort in the Pacific against the third Axis power, Japan. The Dutch were gone, having surrendered their East Indies colonies to the ascendant Asian power. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Muri and his crew were among thousands of American sailors, soldiers, and flyers stationed in the Pacific. All knew or sensed that combat against Japan's juggernaut was inevitable. How Midway fit into the strategic puzzle, though, was a mystery to Muri and his fellow servicemen. Promoted that spring to first lieutenant, he expressed surprise at the bump in rank in a letter to his wife, Alice. Muri felt like a pawn in an oceanic chess game. U.S. Admiral Chester Nimitz and Japanese Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of opposing naval forces in the Pacific, moved the pieces in this life-and-death contest. Untested in battle, they had never fired a shot in combat. Muri and his crew shared a mixture of excitement and unease during 6 days of suspense on Midway. On June 4th, 1942, they waited for daylight, their minds focused on the increasing likelihood that this day would bring their first wartime mission. The scene was chaotic. Navy PBY scout planes carried out a torpedo run and spotted Japanese shipping, but the vessels the American flyers saw were not what battle planners considered the prized target, Japan's aircraft carriers, best in the world. At 4 a.m. on June 4th, Muri and his crew and the pilots and crews of 3 other B-26s parked along the airstrip heard the rumble of Navy scout planes starting up. 11 Catalina PBYs took to the air, searching for the approaching Japanese fleet. Midway buzzed with activity. Telephones rang. Officers barked orders to those not already at assigned defensive posts. Man your stations. It was still too dark to see, but the Marauder men could hear 16 big bombers warming up. B-17 Flying Fortresses launched to hit the Japanese from high altitude. Parenthetically, this mission failed. Then came electrifying news, a 5:45 a.m. radio message from a Catalina scout plane that had spotted 2 Japanese carriers sailing about 200 miles northwest of Midway. The main body of the fleet was in range. The pilot of another Navy scout plane saw dozens of Japanese fighters and bombers launch from the carriers, speeding towards the American base. He had no time to encrypt his message sent in the clear, but only to Navy radios. Remember, these guys were the Army. They were working with the Navy, but they were not Navy. So they weren't on the same channel. Many airplanes heading Midway, bearing 320, distance 150. Captain Jim Collins, a Louisianan who commanded the B-26, told his airmen to check their planes again. A few gulped coffee while they anticipated immediate action. Collins told what happened next. At 6:15, a messenger in a speeding jet brought me a note giving the position of our target and its distance. Joe Warner, an Army officer serving as a liaison between Nimitz's command and the Army flyers on temporary duty at the atoll, delivered the message. Japanese planes are inbound. We've spotted the enemy fleet, Warner said. As light broke over the Pacific, the top brass at Midway and on 2 U.S. carriers off Midway harbored no doubt that beyond the horizon lay the Japanese carriers. This was the prize Americans had sought since breaking Japan's code and learning of the island's nation to invade Midway. Commanding officers, however, left low-ranking officers like Muri guessing about the foe they would confront. All they got was a vague hint of Japanese shipping they were to hit in the Pacific. Your target's at 320 degrees, 150 miles out, Warner shouted, go. The din of dozens of warming up warplanes grew louder. 6 Navy Avenger torpedo planes took off first. Then 4 B-26 bombers thundered down the runway and into the sky. The B-26s at Midway carried torpedoes, and so did 10 B-26s defending the Aleutians against the diversionary attack by the Japanese on the same day. It was the only time planes flown by the Army Air Force or by its successor, the Air Force, ever used torpedoes in combat. Jim Muri, as pilot of Susie Q, the nickname of his bomber, and which was the nickname he gave to his wife Alice. They had been married about 6 months at that time. Joined a wave of 10 Army and Navy planes that took off from Midway from 6 a.m. to 6:15 a.m. Unbeknownst to the young pilots, they faced overwhelming odds. As noted Midway author Walter Lord wrote, "How could this huge armada lose?" The Japanese fleet, totaling about 190 ships, included 11 battleships, 8 carriers, 23 cruisers, 65 destroyers, dozens of support vessels. It sailed in an 1,800-mile arc across the Pacific. The Japanese Navy deployed 700 planes, 261 on the carriers headed for Midway, and it sent 100,000 men into battle, commanded by 20 admirals who reported to Yamamoto atop the pyramid. Yet Muri joined 27 other Army airmen and 18 Navy flyers, a combined 46 scared young Americans who carried out the initial attack against Japan's massive fleet. They were at the first chapter of the story of one of the greatest naval battles in world history. Muri, a dark-haired Montanan with an Errol Flynn-inspired mustache, and he and the other B-26 pilots had grown to distinguish themselves from Navy pilots, graduated from high school in 1936 and enlisted in the Army. In those early morning hours on June 4th, 1942, he hoped 6 years in the military had prepared him for whatever lay ahead. As the second oldest son of a first-generation Norwegian immigrant and his second-generation German-Swedish immigrant wife, he was half a world away from his roots. He and his 6 brothers and 2 sisters helped their parents work a combined cattle ranch farm in drought-stricken Depression-era eastern Montana. There, catching and breaking broncs running wild represented high adrenaline danger. He never brushed with death in rural Montana, but things would change on that spring morning in 1942. That was when Muri piloted his bomber across the Pacific, running a gauntlet of dozens of Japanese fighter planes and ships blasting a barrage of bullets, cannon shells, and flak. Jim Muri's bravery on the morning of June 4th, 1942 would earn him the Distinguished Service Cross, second only to the Medal of Honor and prestige among Army combat awards. His life began on the High Plains region between the Yellowstone and Missouri rivers. And, well, I'll just read the first paragraph. Chapter 1, I think I may have time. I don't want to shortchange you folks if you're going to pepper me with questions. I am not a military expert. There are people who are 10 times smarter than me as far as bombers and the inside stuff, but I'll do my best. Second chapter, or chapter 1, I should say. Hey, Jim, it's too hot. Let's cool off. Race you to the river. The cry ran out on a scorching summer afternoon when Jim Muri and the three brothers closest to him in age, Bill, Andy, and Bob, decided they had to beat the heat. Those Muris, plus three younger brothers and two sisters, 9 children total, grew up in Carterville, an eastern Montana ranching community. Jim and his brothers attended and graduated from high school in the region's de facto city, Miles City, which had a population of 7,175 in the 1930 census. Both places lie along the Yellowstone River, a rough and tumble stream that meanders through and shapes the Great Plains landscape. And then I go on to describe the boys' hijinks of the 1930s, such as skinny dipping in the Yellowstone River when some girls come across them, having an impromptu rodeo when a cow gets away and gets kind of scraped up, and they have to explain to their dad what kind of strange disease it has to explain the bruises on the cow's flanks and so on and so forth. Back when kids didn't have TV, I guess they probably had some radio, but they had to pretty much entertain themselves. So I'd be glad to take any questions.
Does anybody have any questions? Is this working?
Yes, sir.
What was the outcome of their engagement when they got to Asia?
When they got there, that is so murky, okay? This is an artist's depiction. I had a guy out in Seattle. There were no photographs. There were you could see photographs of the Midway engagement, but they didn't have cameras with them. So Jim drew a map showing his plane. As he came in, Collins was on one side. Apparently, both, and I'm drawing a blank now on the pilots of the other two who with their crew were tragically lost at sea. Collins came in on one side. Akaji had shifted, so it wasn't, and they're my naval terms. If I have any Navy guys here, if you're this way instead of this way, long way, so you'd be a smaller target. And they thought they launched their torpedoes. We don't know for sure. I think they came back to Midway with no torpedoes in their base. Their torpedoes, they had put them on. Those bombers were made so they could carry torpedoes, and from what I've heard, they were almost dragging on the runway. And they didn't hit anything. If you know anything about U.S. torpedoes at the beginning of World War II, they were awful, terrible. They'd spin around in circles, and we got better, but in the beginning, they were dreadful. So they didn't hit anything. So Jim is flying in, imagine this, I don't know how high, then one of the biggest ships in the world, the Akaji, sat in the water, but very high. He's got this bomber, he's coming in, and his co-pilot, Colonel Muri, is saying, pull up, pull up, pull up. And he banks that plane at some crazy angle, and he goes the wrong way down that deck. But he later said that he flew about 50 feet off. He could have put his wheels down and landed on the Akaji. What saved his bacon and that of the 7 other people on that plane is that the Japanese had their guns pointed out. They had almost a clear shot going down. They got hit by Zeros and some anti-aircraft fire coming in. Now, to answer your question, what happened? It is so murky that to this day, the consensus I've read is that the Japanese had sent their initial wave in to attack Midway. They were going to soften it up. They weren't sure where the carriers were. They wanted to get the carriers, which of course they had missed at Pearl Harbor. They knew they were out there somewhere, but their first priority was getting Midway to soften it up, not to totally destroy it, but apparently they wanted to use it as a base. They go in there, and they're coming back. In fact, ships crossing in the night. I believe some of either the Avengers or the B-26s saw, they're going out to the ship, and they saw the planes coming in. And as the first wave of Japanese bombers coming back, they're radioing to their command, we need to do it up again. We didn't finish the job. And then meanwhile, out of the blue come these torpedo planes. They did not know that they came from land. Midway was like this unsinkable land carrier. All they know is torpedo planes are supposed to take off from carriers, right? It's conventional wisdom. They see 10 of them, 6 Navy planes, and they say, they must have come from a carrier. But meanwhile, they've got this conflicting opinion. And their planes, and again, I'm not an expert on this, but apparently their planes could be changed from carrying bombs to torpedoes. And if you've watched the Midway movie, there was mass confusion with the elevators going up and down and people saying, okay, put bombs on, no torpedoes, no bombs, no torpedoes. It was like well, I won't use a certain obscenity that some of you may know, but it was that going on there, and it took time, took precious time. And meanwhile, Dick Best and Wade McCluskey, when I think of the heroism of those people, it brings on emotion. But anyway, they were out. They were running out of fuel. And there was a submarine, the Nautilus, that was a U.S. submarine that was also in the action. And the Nautilus somehow got in the middle of the Japanese fleet. And they tried depth charging it. The Japanese did. And they couldn't get it. They'd go down and settle up. And this one destroyer suddenly found itself 10 miles or what away from the main fleet. And because he's trying to get Nautilus. And all of a sudden he says, hey, gang, wait up for me. So he boogies. He leaves a wake. And I can't remember whether it was Best or McCluskey looking down. They're almost out of fuel. They're almost going to have to turn around and go back to, I was getting mixed up. Did they come? I think they came from the Enterprise, maybe the Hornet. Don't hold me to this. One of the carriers. And he says, that's interesting. Wonder where that guy's coming from. So he follows that water trail, and they come in out of the clouds, and the rest, as they say, is history. Now, so many people I discovered to this day do not know the role that those Army bombers played in that. They think it was all Navy, and that the Navy, and please, if you're a Navy guy, I mean no offense, but it was, these guys, the B-26s, they weren't Navy, but they were under, part of a Navy operation. They set up the killing blow, if you will. And sadly, you can find, I was talking to Sylvia Sodity, Jim's daughter, who lives in Nashville, Tennessee. She said that she was going to a B-26 Marauder convention. They get together, now it's like third generation. All the original ones are almost all gone. There's a handful. B-26s also were in Europe. But they were at Blacksburg, Virginia, at Virginia Tech. And one gentleman, a friend of Jim Muri's, a son of his, was talking to a World War II historian. He said, it was all Navy. The guy he was a world historian, and he had no idea that those Army bombers played a key role. Enough of a role that if you look at the archives, the New York Times played up their role. In fact, when the Army guys got back to Hawaii, got back to Oahu sooner than the guys on the ship. Planes, of course, can go faster. I would love to have been a fly on the wall in the bars in Honolulu, because apparently the initial press was that the Army bombers, the B-17s and the B-26s, had sunk those ships, which was total baloney. but I think there were probably some fisticuffs between Army and Navy guys over that point. Yes, sir.
Yeah, standard Navy doctrine when under attack from many directions.
Excuse me?
The standard Navy direction is to go full speed, flank speed, and then maneuver left and right as needed to try and avoid attack. Is it known, did the Susie Q fly straight down the axis of the Akagi, or did it more go kind of a glancing blow?
I don't know, and of course these were Army pilots. They, it was so murky. They didn't even really know that it was, quote, Japanese shipping. It could have been some freighters out there somewhere. Go and sink some ships. They had no idea that it was a carrier, that it was 4 carriers. Several of the carriers were up in the Aleutians, and I think Yamamoto held some of them behind. But they, I think and all we have for the record is, I think I have it in the book here somewhere, is Jim's handwritten diagram from his memory saying, we came in this way, whether he came in from the right or the left as he was flying in, and I pretty much banked and went straight down the deck, and then what's amazing, it's almost biblical, is that he had wounded crew members. He needed to get them to medical attention. Fortunately, none of them were fatally wounded, and he didn't know where Midway was. They're circling out there. They have no radios. They're out in the Pacific, and they see this pillar of black smoke from the Japanese bombing of Midway, and they say, I think that's where we're supposed to go. And they crash land. Both of them crash landed. I can't remember the fate of Collins' plane, but Susie Q was so shot up, they started counting bullet holes. They got to 500 on part of the plane, and they said, forget it. There's too many to count here. And this thing is a wreck. So they pushed it into, if you know the term, lagoon, not like a sewage lagoon, a lagoon, a body of water like an atoll. They pushed it into the... Now, I don't know how deep that water is. They're finding more and more World War II wrecks, ships out there. I would love it if somebody found the Susie Q. Well, for that matter, what they did is the crew members took part of the fuselage, the part that said Susie Q, and Jim's son, also named Jim, who's an Army veteran, lives out in the Tacoma area, has been on a crusade ever since I started working with him to find that through maybe in a American Legion or hanging in a VFW post down in Southern California somewhere, because the Susie Q, you're not going to get the whole plane, but even a part of that belongs in the Smithsonian. That is one of the most famed planes of World War II. So there you have it. There are still mysteries of Midway that we may or may not solve in the years to come.
Okay, we got the mic fixed. If you could use the microphone that way, because we're taping this, that way the folks at home can hear the question also. And let me come around. Shell?
Sir, is that Midway carrier the same one that's tied up in San Diego Bay?
The Midway, well, that's a good question. No, there wasn't. The U.S. had the Enterprise, the Hornet, let's see, the Yorktown. Now I'm drawing. And one of them, the amazing thing was that the one that was in the Battle of the Coral Sea, the miracle that showed up because they took it back to Honolulu, and Nimitz said, fix this thing. and we're going to sail in like 3 days. And the story I've heard is they were using so much electricity, the welders and everything, that lights were dimming all over the island. But Midway, the carrier itself, I believe, and I'm getting a little fuzzy on my memory, I want to see it. I think it came later. It was built later. But there is, who was I talking to? Of course, we lost the Hornet and the outcome. And I believe, somebody told me just the other day that we almost immediately built to play mind games with the Japanese. We built another carrier, called it the Hornet, so they could say, thought we got that one, but here it is again. Psych ops warfare, even in World War II.
Dennis, can you elaborate a little more about how this kid from eastern Montana became a star pilot? Did he have any experience crop dusting? Any experience as a pilot as a kid? Or
Yeah.
how did he become a pilot?
Well, that is a fascinating story. If you know commercial aviation, the history of commercial aviation in the state, somewhere in the early 30s, perhaps spurred by helped by Lindbergh's goodwill tour, where he said, commercial aviation, we got to have good airports and stuff. This is the future. So Northwest Airlines started running flights that from Minneapolis to Seattle. They would make stops. They were flying early Ford trimotors. They would stop in Glendive, Miles City, Billings, Helena, Butte, Missoula, and continue on to the coast. And in those early days of really primitive navigation, when they were coming through eastern Montana, they pretty much just followed the Yellowstone River Valley. I don't know how high they flew, but you could look up and say, oh, there's the Wednesday plane from the Twin Cities heading to the West Coast. The story I've heard is that Jim realized that agriculture, if you know the history of eastern Montana, agriculture in the 30s was just, you were going to go broke and starve and everything else. You had to find a different occupation. And he got the flying bug and decided that he would, of course there was no Air Force at that time, he and a buddy, a fellow by the name of Schwartz, both signed up out of Miles City, signed up roughly the same time. They graduated in the class of 36 from Custer County High School and signed up for the Army and said, I don't think you had to pay your dues. He went back to what was then Chanute Airfield in central Illinois, and I've seen pictures of him. He had to shovel coal to help fuel the boilers and do all kinds of stuff, hoping for his break so that somebody to let him learn to fly. And let's see, where did he take it? He took some early flights, and then he ended up out in Riverside, California, which is where Alice, his wife, was from, and finished his training there.
Riverside is March Air Force Base.
Is what?
Riverside is right by March Air Force Base.
Yeah.
It's still a base.
Yeah, it was, there was another name for it before it was and Edwards is up, yeah. But I have to read my own book to remember. Yeah, the base that's close to Riverside. March, yeah. But so the upshot, Chuck, is that he had this dream of becoming a pilot, and the military seemed the best way to do it. And they had no money. He couldn't Well, he did. He went over to Miles City. His buddy, Schwartz, apparently was a little bit more well-heeled. He was in one of the big saddle-making companies over there. He was taking flying lessons. So Jim would get on the train, the Milwaukee Railroad, and ride over to Miles City and watch his buddy fly at the Miles City airport. That was another inspiration to say, you lucky duck, I hope someday I get to fly an airplane. And tragically, his buddy was shot down in a few months before that in New Guinea. He was in a in a two-man plane with another Montanan, by the way, from I think Forsyth, Big Timber. I've got it in the book somewhere. Again, I'm getting a little fuzzy on the details of my own book because I was doing all this work. I have to reread my own stuff. He was shot down, and if you go someday, if I ever get to Manila in the Philippines, there's a big wall with all of the Americans who were lost I don't know if it's all of the Americans, that would be thousands of them, but some portion, and Schwartz and this other guy from Billings are listed there. And as a lot of you know, right here in this building I found the plaque that has Montanans who died in World War II, and I'm proud to say that my first cousin once removed a Marine named Herbert Hoffer is listed in that company. Proud and sad to say, because it was a grievous loss to his mother.
I have a question. Did any of Jim's brothers follow him into the...
Yes, they did. It was a flying family. His oldest brother, Bill, who I had the pleasure of meeting, was the only one in the family who didn't have some amount of military service, including one of the two sisters. Bill lost part of a leg. It got a farm accident. He got caught in a wagon wheel or something. So he was not a paraplegic. He had to use I don't know whether he had a prosthetic or a wheelchair, but he could not serve in the military. Bill was the oldest. Jim was next. Andy was next. Andy was a B-24 pilot in the Pacific. Then came, maybe I got the orders wrong. Then came Bill, or no, let's see. The oldest, here I'm getting mixed up. The oldest, I can't remember the oldest name, but there was another one named Bill who was a B-17 pilot who was shot down over Germany, spent about 17 months or so in a POW camp. Then there was a man named Albert, but everybody called him Buck Muri. He's the father of the woman I know. He was in the Merchant Marines, which became part of the Navy during World War II. There was a sister whose nickname was Toots. She was an Army nurse. Another sister I don't think served in the war. And then the two youngest brothers, one of them was part of a legendary Grizzly basketball team in the 50s, a freshman basketball team. Chuck, do you remember who I'm talking about? The basketball team that was the Wonder Kinds. He was on that team. But anyway, these two, one of them I think served in Korea, and one of them served his country in peacetime in the 50s by going over to Europe and playing basketball and baseball. You know, that's important. We got to defend the country. So it was quite a military family. Yeah.
I can just imagine the stories at family reunions and gatherings.
Yeah.
And
Well, and the family ribbing was Jim. His log shows he might have spent, trying to remember, 2 or 3 hours flying out there, doing his thing, coming back. And then the Army, Hap Arnold and George and Marshall, they knew about him, and they said, hey, this guy knows stuff about torpedo, so we're going to take him out of combat. They sent him down to Eglin Airfield in the panhandle of Florida. So he served as the head torpedo training guy for about 1.5 years there. Then he got transferred to Watertown, South Dakota, had a base. That's where Sylvia Sodity, his daughter, was born in 1945, and he was there. And so the joshing from his brothers was, that shirker, he spent about 4 hours of actual combat, and he gets all this publicity, and we schmucks do all this other, spend all this other time. So I'd love to have been part of those family, the family bantering there.
do we have any more questions? We'll just pass this down.
I'm from Miles City and Custer County, and I have 2 classmates that are in journalism, Charlie Hood and Mayo Ashley. I was just curious if you knew them, and also I served in the Navy, and so in 59 and 60, I think it was. I operated with the Hornet and the Midway, but this must be the later ships then.
I believe so. The Hornet, definitely, they built another one. And you probably know better than me. I don't know the full, I know there's that you can tour the Midway down at San Diego, correct?
Right, that's correct.
And I plan to do that. Now, as to your question, yes, I know, I don't know if I ever met him, but I know of Mayo Ashley. And who was the other man that you mentioned?
Charles Hood. He ended up becoming the dean of journalism
Oh,
a few years before he passed
yeah.
before he passed away.
And I'll put in a plug right here for that part of the country. I got my job working at the Gazette my senior year at West High in Billings in '68. My father took me down to the Gazette office. It was brand new then, the building was brand new, and introduced me to a fellow named Norm Clark, who was from Terry. And Norm was my first boss, and still remains the most influential person in my journalism career. Even before I went to journalism school, he had enough confidence in me to send me out later on to cover various events in Billings, tournament games, and so on. And so Norm and I, hey Norm, we're fellow Terry Terriers.
The Muri family I'm somewhat familiar with too, although most of them probably were a little older than me.
Yeah. Well, and Norm, some of you may know, Norm was, before he came to Billings as the Gazette sports editor, he was the Independent Record sports editor for a little while too, yeah, here in Helena.
Norm followed Mayo Ashley as the sports editor here. Mayo went to Butte, then the Great Falls Tribune. But
Right.
Charlie Hood was a good friend of mine, and there's a great story about Charlie Hood. He was a good basketball player in Miles City, a really good player, all-state. And they were playing Hardin with Larry Prettyweasel.
Oh.
And Charlie was to guard him, and he held him to like 12 or 14 points the first half and thought he was doing pretty well. And then Prettyweasel at halftime comes out with some horn-ridden glasses no one had ever seen him wear and made like 30 points in the second half.
Oh, the stories that, Ed, you probably, Chuck, you know about another part of the lineage too for some of us is Gordy Spear down in Miles City. Gordy was the sports editor of the Miles City Star for many years. I went to high school with his son Randy, and Gordy was he was a big man, I don't know, 6'5", 6'6". He got a basketball scholarship or something to the University of Minnesota. Yeah.
I'd like to ask the audience, do we have any veterans here?
Yeah. Okay. I'm sorry for hogging that with inside journalism talk.
Yeah, thank you for your service. And our time is up, Dennis. But you're going to be stationed
Right.
out here signing books.
Yes,
So-
and if you didn't get a chance to ask a question, pin me down. You make me squirm.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.